So, hi, folks, and welcome to another episode on NetSupport Radio. And I am really excited that today we have got Danny Bauer with us. Danny, welcome to the show.
Al, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me here, and just honored that you invited me. So appreciate it.
It is our pleasure, and always happy to have a chief ruckus maker on the show. So, looking forward to talking to you. I was running
Yeah,
through some of the background bits to talk about with you, Danny, and there's quite a lot to cover. So I'm going to provide a very brief introduction, but then get you to actually expand a bit more. So
sure.
one thing that's an easy one is I know you're a very highly sought after coach and mentor to thousands of school leaders. You have an amazing resource and website, Better Leaders, Better Schools. You've also got a podcast, and to keep things nice and simple, also called Better Leaders, Better Schools. And rather enviously, yours is in the top 0.5% of most downloaded shows. So I've got some work to do to catch you on that, but congratulations to you on that, sir. And
Thank you.
last but not least, you changed the name just to confuse me here. You couldn't have called your book Better Leaders, Better Schools. That would have been nice and simple. But instead, you went for Mastermind, Unlocking Talent Within Every School Leader. And I'm really looking forward to just kind of deep diving a little bit around that and some of the concepts behind your book.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Al. The first book's Better Leaders, Better Schools, so that's why, right? The second book is Mastermind, and I never necessarily do things that are easy. It would make a lot of sense that my Twitter and all the places I show up social media wise, that would be branded, right? Better Leaders, Better Schools, or BLBS. But actually, my Twitter handle, Instagram handle, is Alien Earbud. What's going on there, right? So as a former English teacher, I love word games. And if you ever played an anagram, right, you take a phrase or a few words, you mix up the letters and see what else you could spell. So I took my name, Daniel Bauer, mixed up all the letters, and I got an image that I thought was, interesting to me, provocative. I saw this little alien that visited Earth, and they had some earbuds in, just like I do today. And that's been my, social media handle forever. But as you can tell, I was a chronically late student. Did you know that, Al? So not that any teachers ever have, late students to their classes. But I found myself just not able to make it to class on time. And I was there late again, first period, chemistry, taught by Mr. Rogers, which is like, can you come up with a better name for a teacher? And I'm thinking, how do I get out of detention? Or at this point, I've been late so often, I might be suspended, right, Al? This is terrible. So I'm there 10 minutes, 11 minutes late, definitely going to get in trouble. And I say, Mr. Rogers, this time I can explain, right? And I said, on my way to school, I passed by, one of the houses in the neighborhood, and it was on fire. And not only was the house on fire, but there was an entire Girl Scout troop inside who needed saving, right? And I looked around. There was no Batman. There was no Spider-Man. Like, it was me or they're in trouble, like peril. And so I of course, I saved the whole entire Girl Scout troop, extinguished the flames. And I'm not sure if it was the story that got me out of detention and suspension that day, or the very real do-si-do, which is a peanut butter cookie that the Girl Scouts offer. But I got off scot-free, no trouble at all. And what I learned there is that it pays to tell stories, right? And I've been telling stories ever since.
I love that as an introduction. That's a really good way of kicking things off. And you're right, telling stories, that the beauty of language and the way that we express ourselves is something absolutely we want to celebrate. I'm going to dive into your second book, not your first book, to talk to you about Mastermind, Unlocking Talent with Every School Leader. I'm really curious, although obviously if anyone's done a bit of reading and knows you, it probably won't be too hard to figure out. But what motivated you to write your book?
The interesting thing here, and from a meta level for your audience and listener, I want to encourage people to stay focused on creating something of value and creating a point of view that's interesting and maybe different and new and unique, and just to do the work consistently and continue to show up, right? I think that's what, like, Stephen Pressfield, The War of Art, I'm sure you're familiar with his book, and he calls that being a professional. And that's an important context, because I never wanted to write this book, to be quite honest. I got really, really lucky. And in 2019, I was living near your neck of the woods, like closer than I am now, at least. I was living in Glasgow, Scotland. And all the education publishers in the US, at least, reached out. They wanted to do a book. Now, most of them wanted me to pitch an idea, right, of what to write about. Corwin was different. And what Corwin said is the way you're showing up and serving school leaders is different. We're not seeing anybody else talk about this concept of the mastermind. You're the guy to write the book. And that sent them to the top of the list, right? And, we inked a deal, and that's how the book got here. But another important part of that story is that the first draft, I'm sure you can relate, like the first draft was garbage, right? It was rubbish, is what some people might say. And I was quite worried because I wanted to create something of value. Plus, it's how I serve school leaders, and I didn't know how to turn something into a book form that would be of value to the reader and not make it a 200-page sales letter, if we're honest, right?
Yeah.
So after the first draft, what I realized is to write a better book, I actually stopped writing completely, and I started taking my puppy out, Alba, which is Gaelic for Scotland because we loved living there so much. And we went around Berry Park here in upstate New York and just would take walks in nature. And I would let my mind really wander. And I thought, you know what? I need a framework of why our community works. So I don't know if you could relate, when you're operating in your gifts or, your zone of genius, as Gay Hendricks from The Big Leap would call it. It's like riding a bike. You just show up and you do it. It's natural. And that, for me, facilitating masterminds is certainly one of my superpowers. So I started thinking, what's the framework? What's the framework? And I also thought, okay, can I create something that would be maybe catchy in education, right? There's the ABCs, 1, 2, 3. So I started thinking, all right, how can I play with ABC? And I saw it. I saw it in my mind in Berry Park. Authenticity, belonging, challenge. And if I could organize the book around those concepts, I'm like, I got it. And when I shared that with the editor, she said, that's it. Do that. You have the intro and the conclusion and, unpack the rest. And it worked out. And now, to date, at least that's the thing that I've created that I'm the most proud of.
It's an interesting process. And I love you sharing your experiences there. I've spent years writing 1,000-word articles or commenting on different topics that are close to my heart, have my experience. But when it came to writing the first book, I think there was almost a sense of, I guess it was imposter syndrome. I'm going to put it out there for judgment. People are going to look at it and say, well, who's he to tell me this is the definitive way or the best practice or the guide? And so I think, like all these things, it's very hard to not be your own worst critic, and you start to doubt yourself more than you would do normally professionally.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Back to Stephen Pressfield, though, in The War of Art, like he talks about the imposter syndrome, and he gives it the name, the resistance, right? I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but essentially that idea of being the professional is just showing up day after day, no matter how you feel, and committing to doing something, and that gets you through the hard bits, right? So the imposter is still there, but slowly the voice gets quieter and quieter. It never goes away completely. But if you continue to show up and you're in the routine and the habit of just like sitting down and I'm going to do what I'm going to do today, you're able to move forward and make great progress.
Wise words indeed, Danny. So listen, anybody who's interested in the book, can you give us a few takeaways, top tips, things that you'd like to share?
Well, one of the things, to be honest, like I'm not really interested in doing a lot of research, but since I was working with Corwin, like that's part of their brand. So I was challenged to do that. And I'm happy for it because I learned a lot going through that process. And I found a study that was done in 2020. It was done by the National Association of Elementary School Principals here in the States and the Learning Policy Institute. And they surveyed about 407, I think, school leaders. So nothing to sneeze at. That's a pretty decent sample size. It's certainly, not you and your mom and your immediate family. And what they found, talking to these school leaders about their professional practice, some shocking statistics, like 32% spent time sharing leadership practices with their peers 3 or more times in the last 2 years. Just 32%, right? Even more shocking, only 23% had access to a coach or a mentor in the last 2 years. So can you imagine that? 1 out of every 4 school leaders had access, to a coach or a mentor. And if that leader served in a high poverty situation and environment, that was actually only 10%. So, that's part of like raising the alarm and ringing the bell. Like, to me, the motto at Better Leaders, Better Schools is, everyone wins when you get better, right? When Al gets better, there's this ripple effect within his community.
Yeah.
So that's sort of.
Sorry, I was going to say, Dan, we have similar conversations in some of the schools that I'm responsible for, and sometimes there's a mindset because of capacity and pressure. We don't have the time to go out and do professional development externally, and one of the narratives is always, well, we're worried if they get too skilled, they might find opportunities and move somewhere else. And I always try and counter that with what's worse than losing your best staff, and the answer is keeping your worst staff. And then actually going out always brings back far more. And that's the key element, I guess, isn't it? You've got to go outside to bring fresh ideas back into your school.
Well, it's getting outside of the fishbowl, or we all develop blind spots, and there's a certain way of doing things around here. And so it's nice to bring in fresh ideas. But the other counter to that is like, okay, you're going to develop people and maybe one day they'll leave. Well, that's actually good marketing for your community, because then it's like, hey, we develop our leaders. That's a good story you want told about yourself. The opposite of that is, what if you don't develop them and they stay, right? Which is, I think, what you're saying about worst performers. That's mind-boggling. It makes zero sense. So there's obviously a great need, to develop school leaders for sure.
Absolutely. You touched on earlier, you talked about the ABC and that inspiration as you brought those together. Just for those listening, could you unpack a little bit about the ABC framework and how that ties in with professional development?
Right. So when I was thinking about why the mastermind community is such a powerful professional development experience for school leaders, built that framework, ABC. So the authenticity, each part is made up of like three subdomains, right? So authenticity is all about safety, self-awareness, and being values driven. So when you read that chapter, it unpacks and really dives deeply into all those ideas. Belonging is fueled by shared purpose, an inclusive environment, and trust. Trust is like the essential foundation, right, for great leadership. And then when it comes to challenge, I talk a lot about mindset. That's one of my favorite topics, taking action, and then surrounding yourself in a powerful community. So that's the framework, at a very high level. I'm happy to explore, any of those with you, but you could definitely get more, and you should get more, right? Go buy the book.
Absolutely. Go find out more. I mean, I'm always interested. It's an area I touched on actually in one of my books about growth mindset and focusing. Where do you see the areas of most challenge for school leaders at the moment? Of those strands, where is the area where we feel there's perhaps the most vulnerability?
I think there's a real threat to not developing yourself, like you already mentioned, right? Like, what if you don't develop your school leaders and they stick around? And one of the things I want to be known for is to show up in this space and tell leaders that they're worth it, right? What I know about school leaders is, at least in North America, right? They're an educator first in the classroom. And classroom educators have huge hearts, right? They are so compassionate. At least the good ones are, right? There's some in the profession. You're like, why are you here? Do you even like kids, right? But if we're honest, that's a
tiny percentage.
Yeah. So they have these big hearts, and they're very service oriented. But the problem is, then they get into a leadership role, and they're so used to giving, which they should still do. They forget the importance of like leadership boundaries and taking care of themselves, and the metaphor that is often used, right, with the airplane, you put the oxygen mask on yourself before helping somebody else. And what I find with school leaders is they help everybody else until they are burnt out, right? Their battery is fully depleted. It's on like, I don't even know what negative energy is, but that's what they're operating on. And there's no, it's not a surprise that they're looking for greener pastures somewhere else. Yeah. The joke, though, the punchline is that it's actually not another industry. It has to do with you, you know, and do you take care of yourself? Do you set those boundaries? Do you enroll yourself in opportunities to grow and that kind of thing? Do you build a team, delegate? I mean, we can go as deep as you want, but I think that's one of the greatest threats. And so I'm just trying to show up and say, one, you're worth it, and there's awesome opportunities out there. Could be with me, could be with you, could be with like all sorts of amazing people that want to help school leaders level up. But that's my mission, to connect, grow, and mentor every school leader who wants to level up. And if we connect that to Simon Sinek's Infinite Game, I don't have to compete with other people in the marketplace of education. We all need to show up and fulfill that mission to make communities better around the world. And that's the game I'm playing.
Absolutely, absolutely. One thing we've seen here in the UK, and I've seen it in many countries around the world, and I think increasingly in the US, is that we're losing from the profession many of our most experienced educators because of all those different pressures. Do you think there's still a mindset that as a school leader, you're expected to have all the answers and the resilience, and it's almost a sense of weakness to say that you need to look for some external support?
Yeah, I think that's too often the case, right? But what we know from great leaders is that you don't have to have all the answers, you know?
Absolutely.
And so there's a tension there, figuring out like how do you have the courage and authenticity and the ability just to show up and say, you know what, that's not me. Like somebody was asking me about SEL stuff the other day, right? And I said, well, I could talk about it to some extent, but that's not where my expertise is. And let me point you to some better resources, because I'm not the guy for that. And I've learned to become comfortable knowing what my strengths are and then where I need help, right? So I think school leaders, you know, could use that bolstering, but the communities like the boards of education and everybody that puts those expectations on leaders, you know, that's shame on them type of thing, right? Like that's unfair.
Absolutely.
They can't be an expert on everything. And I guess unless you want to drive your school and your community and your head teacher or principal into the ground, continue to put those unrealistic expectations on them or build them up. It's like, it's a choice. And so what do you want?
I'm really glad you kind of shared that. And I think it is a case of shame on them, because we see in schools the natural progression of amazing teachers that become department heads, they become head teachers, and in the UK structure, they then become CEOs or exec heads of school districts, or our school academy trusts, as we call them. And the idea that from that career and progression as an educator, you would magically be an HR, finance, legal expert, and all the other challenges that drop onto the plate. And of recent years, crisis management leaders and all the other strands.
Yeah.
In many ways, if somebody says, I've got all the answers, that's probably the most unbelievable person in the room, as opposed to the one that says, in reality, none of us could possibly know all of it.
No way. It's impossible. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's just crazy.
Thank you for sharing that, Danny.
Pleasure.
What is one positive attribute you see in today's emerging school leaders? We've talked about, possible weaknesses or areas of vulnerability, but where would you see the kind of the positive attribute that stands out, and one that perhaps still needs a bit of refining?
To me, in terms of positive, I look at empathy, right? Like with younger leaders in younger generations, you see that developed at a high level. Like they really care about others, and they want to, for whatever, like how are we going to define it? They want to make the world a better place, right? And they're very, very much like driven by that idea. So salary or time on the job and that kind of stuff, I mean, it's a factor, but it's more about alignment with values and that kind of thing. The refinement piece is just, again, and this is global, not just with younger leaders, but to know that, the number one enemy to excellence is isolation, right? We got to break out of trying to do things on your own. And that's a leadership myth as well. So not only do you not have to be an expert at everything and know the answers to all questions, you also don't have to hold this all by yourself, right? And so what that community and what you build around yourself looks like, that's up to you to define. That question's asked to you, so you must define it. But just don't go it alone, right? That's a quick path to failure for sure.
Wise words, sir. So on the book front, most people have always got those little ideas starting to formulate in their heads. So have you got any plans for another book? Is there anything
Um,
shaping in your head, just starting to tickle the interest?
yeah. How much time do we have? I wrote down like so many book titles. I recently, I don't know, have you ever been to Colombia by any chance in South America?
I have not, unfortunately. No.
So my business coach lives there. He splits his time in California, in Medellin, Colombia, and he had his like flagship, live event and invited us out there. So we had like 2-3 days of leadership and business, training and that kind of thing. And then we spent 2 days, which was wonderful, whitewater rafting and hanging out in the jungle, right? Like in the rainforest,
Fantastic.
actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that space of being able to unplug and that kind of thing, a kabillion ideas came into my head and like just furiously trying to journal them down. Uh, I won't bore you with all the details of all the books, but I would like to say, talk about the approach. And one of the things I'm thinking about is what does it mean to write like extremely practical, useful books without the fluff? You know what I mean? And have you ever read a book, where you pick it up and it's 200, 250 pages, and then you find yourself just skimming because you want the meat, like, tell me what to do, how do I do it type of thing, and I don't
You
need
do?
the rest. Yeah, so I'm thinking a lot about that. And the reason why is, a couple of reasons. One, I read a book called Bumpers by Nick Preston. I don't get any money if you pick it up, buy it or whatever, but it's a great book. And it really transformed my life in just 31 pages, right? And it's really
Wow.
shocking how good it is and transformative it is in just 31 pages. And then I read another book. I'm forgetting the author's name, but the whole idea is write useful books, I think is the title, or how to write useful books. And so I'm really thinking about that. And can I maybe put it out at a quicker cadence as well? And just put out stuff that is extremely practical. You could apply it like immediately, see results, because I think we're in the results, creating results for the leaders we support type of business. So that's at least the framework that I'm using. And then there's a kabillion topics, that I'm going to put through that framework.
It's really interesting, though, Danny, because increasingly when you see, particularly in education books, there is a move to series of smaller accessible books in a set rather than one mighty tome. And we are increasingly moving as a species, frankly, to liking our information and content in bite-sized chunks. So there's a lot to be said for that. I always introduce my books as saying that they're more Enid Blyton than Jane Austen. Now, I don't know whether Enid Blyton is an author that you come across in the US, but
I'm missing the joke, but I'm guessing that it's practical.
It's a children's author, shall we say. So okay. Children's stories versus Jane Austen. But I do sign up to the, you know what, sometimes less is more. Just say it as it is, plain English, make it accessible and people value it. We are talking about writers and stories here. And given your storytelling skills, I thought I would ask you one question to wrap up our conversation. I caught on your website a reference to some aha moments, and I immediately expected some 80s disco music to be available to me. Again, hopefully aha was available across the pond. But obviously in your case, it wasn't. It's about those kind of moments that just click for you. So I thought it'd be nice to wrap up if you wouldn't mind sharing an aha moment with our listeners.
Yeah, and who knows whatever's on my website. I need to go look at what my ahas were, but I'll tell you what. Let me give you one aha. And so I was working for the Board of Education at the central office level in Chicago Public Schools. It may still be the third largest school district. I don't know if Houston is overpassed it. You got New York City, you got LA, then it's Chicago, Houston. So I'm there and I'm working with a program called AVID. And I probably work with like 30 something schools, helping the principal and their AVID teams, implement the AVID program with fidelity. And what you can imagine now is that there is a wide variety of quality of leadership, right, that I see in these schools. I was a teacher who loved teaching, never saw myself as an administrator. I actually didn't even want to work at central office, but I couldn't find a teaching job, and I had moved quite a bit,
Right.
So anyways, I had to establish my network. I ended up getting back in the classroom. But what that experience taught me, and seeing this quality of leaders and the kids ultimately who benefited or suffered, right, as a result of that quality of leadership, the aha was like, I can do this. And I don't know about you, like if I go to a conference, I almost pity the speaker, because half the time I'm like, I could do that better, right? And I'm just curious, do you ever do that, or is that totally me? I don't know if that sounds egotistical or what.
I feel quite guilty saying it, but yes, I think we are all inclined to in different ways. We validate our own confidence by comparing to others, don't we?
Okay. Yeah. And so I'm traveling through these schools, and I'm seeing that there's actually quite a very low bar to be a principal at the time in Chicago. And I'm thinking our kids deserve better, right? And so for me, that was one of the epiphanies, one of the ahas, is like, maybe I should consider that. It took me a few years, and a friend had to call out, really, like, he saw leadership skills in me. And that's what ultimately led me to pursue the administrative certification and become an assistant principal and then a principal. But seeing that quality and that wide variety, like, was definitely a big moment. One more very quick epiphany aha moment was just starting the podcast, right? And my lived experience as a school leader within the context where I led, leadership development looked like this. They'll talk about the 3 big pillars of education: raise student achievement, which is important; increase attendance. Yep, we want kids in school; and decrease discipline, right? We want safe environments. That makes sense. But the problem, the rub for me, was that that's not what got me out of bed, why I wanted to be an educator. And I was really thinking, how do you, in reality, craft a meaningful school vision that actually honestly guides the work of the school and that people are excited about and are rowing in the same direction? I don't know about you, Al. I hate hard conversations. And to be frank, I'm pretty bad at it, so I have to practice it quite a bit. So that was something I was interested in. And then for sure in the US, there are very inequitable systems facing our students, depending on what zip code you're from and what you look like. And I wanted to do something about that, but we weren't talking about it in our leadership meetings. So I started the podcast, and the epiphany for me is pick yourself, choose yourself, right? Because I see a lot of people complain on social media, like, in terms of hours or the challenges, and this is back to leadership boundaries, but it's not called district care, it's called self-care. So choose yourself first, take action. The question, again, is asked to you, and you're the one who's supposed to answer it. It doesn't matter what me or Al think. It's actually, how do you answer it?
Absolutely. I love that, Danny. And I think it's one thing that is always very powerful over the last few years with the growth of podcasts, and that sense of we've moved from being in very much that kind of independent silo to actually being able to sit and engage and hear that you're not alone. There are others dealing with the same challenges, the same pressures, the same, difficult choices, but also you get a chance to hear how others have achieved and failed. And I, for one, always learn more lessons from the things that I do wrong than probably the things that I do well. But actually, it's lovely to feel that, you're just as human as everybody else. And that sense of community that comes from subscribing to a regular podcast and different topics, I think has huge value. To wrap things up, Danny, and it's been a pleasure talking with you. For those listening who would like to find out more about your support that you offer to school leaders, your book, your podcast, any of your books, where's the best place for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, it's quite easy. BetterLeadersBetterSchools.com, right? That's the website, and has everything. You can find the podcast, everywhere that you listen. Daniel at BetterLeadersBetterSchools.com is the email. And if you want to call or text, I welcome it. So in terms of country code, +1, because I'm in the US right now, but +1 312-788-7595 if you ever want to call or text.
You see, I'm still smarting how you lot got 1 and we got 44. It seems very unfair.
I don't know.
Always good to end on a competitive note, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Danny, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining NetSupport Radio today.
Al, thanks for the invitation. It was a pleasure to show up and have a conversation with you.